Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a Imago Day. Soy Andrés Vázquez y estoy de nuevo aquí con otra entrevista. El propósito de estas entrevistas es fomentar el pensamiento crítico entre personas creyentes y no creyentes, ¿no? A través de entrevistas con académicos cristianos y no cristianos. Eh, Mi propósito nuevamente es poder llevar mi granito de arena en este gran debate, ¿no? Sobre la existencia de Dios, la racionalidad del cristianismo. ¿Es razonable creer en Dios? ¿Es razonable ser cristiano? Así que espero realmente que las entrevistas que realizo aquí puedan ser de gran ayuda, no solamente para alguien que es cristiano o cristiana, sino para cualquier persona que busque conocer más de nuestra fe. Así que, bueno, en esta entrevista estoy con el doctor Paul Moser, es un filósofo cristiano y estaremos hablando sobre la experiencia religiosa, si la experiencia religiosa cuenta como evidencia para la racionalidad del cristianismo. Y entre otras preguntas más y otros temas más correspondientes a la racionalidad del teísmo y si podemos creer en Dios de manera racional. Welcome, Dr. Moser. Thank you so much for accepting my interview. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Andres. It's my pleasure.
And before we jump right into the topic, could you briefly introduce yourself for those who don't know you or don't know what you do?
I teach philosophy at Loyola University in Chicago, Illinois. I've been there for some 40 years, teaching theory of knowledge, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, and a number of related topics in philosophy and philosophical theology. And I have been working on some books lately that try to tie together some important lessons from philosophy and theology. And the book that I just finished, be out later this year, is called God in Moral Experience. I am convinced that religious experience of God is the only firm way to what I'll call well-grounded belief that God exists and is good. So I've been pursuing the topic of religious experience and evidence for God based on experience for some years now. I co-edited a collection called the Cambridge Companion to Religious Experience that gives a wide range of views, but I have my own favorite view that comes from some lessons from the New Testament, from the Apostle Paul, and before him from Jesus. And so I've been working out an account that tries to make sense of how God actually works in human life and experience. And that's the focus of the book, God in Moral Experience. And this fits with my own experience, where when I was about 15, a powerful religious experience had a role in redirecting my life. And so that's what led me to focusing on knowledge of God for, I don't know, maybe half a century now, 50 years or more. So it's been a long haul trying to make sense of all of this, but it's been worth the effort.
And well, shortly, I would like you to tell us, a little bit about your testimony. How did you become a Christian?
Well, as I suggested before, when I was about 15, I had a powerful religious experience when I was actually focused on other matters, and it redirected my life toward pursuing what became some vital questions for me about how do we know God if we know God? What does the evidence look like? And so I started to pursue questions in the theory of knowledge, and those led to larger questions about the nature of human experience, the nature of moral experience. And the big question became, given God's character, given God what God is like, what should we expect God's intervention in our experience to be? And I came up with the idea that the experience should match God's character. And so if God is worthy of worship, and I use the word God as a title, suggesting worthiness of worship, if the word God is a title, then we should look for a kind of moral perfection in our experience that reflects worthiness of worship. And what troubled me about a lot of the traditional approaches is that they don't connect to a God worthy of worship. So you could have a design argument, it could be very fancy, but it's not going to get you to a God worthy of worship because nature is terribly mixed. Yes, there's some good, but there's an awful lot of evil. Or the first cause argument, take any version you want. Fine, I'll even give you an inference to a first cause, but it's not going to be an inference to a morally perfect being. We don't need a morally perfect being to get a first cause because what's being caused here is not perfect. It's morally mixed, and there's no sign of any kind of moral perfection. And so those two arguments seem to me hopeless. And the similar arguments you get from consciousness, that won't work either because consciousness doesn't need to bring moral perfection. And for obvious reasons, I think the ontological arguments of failure, because even if it shows that we have an idea of God, implying that God exists, it doesn't follow that there is a God who exists. I don't think you can even get to the required idea, but suppose you did. There's still the separate question of whether reality is like that. Does it have a being who's actually morally perfect? And that's an open question. We would have to look at our experience. We'd have to consider what our actual evidence is. And so I became disenchanted with all of the traditional arguments that are summarized in Aquinas's 5 ways and have been developed endlessly by philosophers since then with great minutiae, but they all fail at the issue of, well, why think that the God in question is actually morally perfect or worthy of worship? And the answer is you shouldn't. Those arguments don't give you that evidence. And so you might say, well, they're a first step. Well, are they? I mean, you can claim that, but why think that they're going to lead to a second step with evidence for a God worthy of worship? And if you do get the second step, then why do we need the first? Is it just a psychological prop? So I've written that these arguments aren't going to take us there, and we need a different approach. And that's what I've been arguing for. But you ask, well, why? A Christian and philosopher, my evidence goes back to my religious experience and what that has convicted me of. And I'd be glad to talk about that if you're interested in what I mean by religious experience.
Sure, I will be delighted. Please dig deeper on religious experience.
Good. So here's the thing. When something is very close to us, we often overlook it. You can have even a fly on your nose and not notice it. It can be sitting there and you can be looking past the fly on your nose. I think the evidence of God is like that. We have it very close to us, but we're looking for something else or at something else. And so we divert our attention from where it really should be to the fly on our nose. Well, what is that fly? I claim that it is in conscience, human conscience. Now, and sometimes we call that moral conscience. It's the place where we're convicted, if we allow it, of right and wrong, of good and bad. It's the place of moral struggle within us. Now, anybody who isn't a psychopath or a sociopath has a functioning conscience. In fact, some psychologists say that the absence of that is what makes a person a psychopath. Maybe so. I'll let that be. But the point is, if you look at this moral struggle within that we often have, sometimes it's at 3 a.m., sometimes it's at 2 a.m. I don't know why it's always in the middle of the night. That's kind of strange, but it always wakes me in the middle of the night. I wish it would just come to me at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., then I wouldn't have to lose so much sleep. So it comes to me at 3 a.m. and it says, you're being too impatient or too heavy-handed for something, or you're not being kind enough, or it can encourage you even at 3 a.m. Conscience isn't just negative. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was wrong. Conscience isn't just thou shalt not do something. It can be positive. It can encourage you. As the Gospel of John says, it can convict you of righteousness, John's Gospel says. And it can. So it can be positive. But we're dealing with a God who is inherently righteous and morally good. That's the biblical God. That's the God worthy of worship. And so we should expect divine righteousness to be at work in our conscience. And guess what? If we look closely, if we look at the fly on our nose instead of past it, lo and behold, that's what we find. We find a struggle within us, assuming we aren't psychopaths. We find a struggle within between righteousness and unrighteousness, moral goodness and moral badness. And guess what? That's no accident. That's God at work. Now, the question really is this: do we allow that convicting work of righteousness to come to fruition, to come to salience, to come to clarity within us? Do we allow that or not? And often we don't. We're too busy with other things like who won the soccer game, or who won the basketball game, or who made the most money. We distract from it. We divert attention. But if we look at it straight away, guess what we see? A kind of nudging, a kind of encouraging toward righteousness and freedom from guilt and shame. That's what's going on in the struggle in conscience. That is God alive in our lives. Now, that's called evidence for God. Is it fallible? Yes, but it's not an argument. We should not confuse evidence with an argument. The evidence from experience is irreducible to an argument. You can formulate an argument on the basis of it, but the ultimate evidence is not an argument. People get all too carried away with arguments when there's something prior. And Aristotle pointed this out long ago in the posterior analytics. You need foundational evidence that isn't a premise in an argument. Well, what is it? It's an experience of some sort. And so this experience in conscience of righteousness trying to lead us to God is the foundational experience. And so the Apostle Paul can say in Romans 8, all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. What's this leading? It's this leading toward cooperation with God's righteousness, with what Paul calls the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. Do we cooperate or not? Do we attend to it or not is the first question. And the answer is typically no. We're looking for something else. And I'm saying stop looking in the wrong place. Look at where God would work with profound consequences in human conscience, nudging us toward character formation in the image of God and his Son, Jesus Christ. That's the kind of experience I'm talking about. Morally robust, nothing, shall we say, spectacular or entertaining. I mean, Paul, the Apostle, was not valuing speaking in tongues or fancy miracles or anything that's showing off. He valued the formation of Christ's character in us through the love that God shows to us as we cooperate. And so Paul can say, faith and hope in God don't disappoint us. This is Romans 5, because the love of God has been poured out into our spirit into our heart by the Holy Spirit given to us. God's righteous love, where is it? You see it in Jesus as he goes to the cross, but you see it too in our conscience when we pay attention.
At the beginning of a book you edited with Dr. Paul Copan, The Rationality of Theism, you respond to a question that I would like you to comment on here. Does theism explain reality much better? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a big question, Andres. Here's what I would say. We have to be careful because this is not just a test for explanation when we ask about the grounds for commitment to God's reality and goodness. It's not just a matter of overall explanation, and it shouldn't be. There's something more profound at work here. For one thing, notice we have to be honest about the problem of evil. The book of Job is right. We don't have an adequate explanation of why God allows evil. We just don't. And at the end of Job, God endorses the view, and you shouldn't expect a full explanation. See, it's one thing to say, oh, we don't have an explanation, but we should have one. It's a better thing to say, yeah, let's be honest. We don't have a full explanation. I don't know why God allowed the earthquake in Turkey and Syria that has now killed, 45,000 people? Or the Holocaust. How many died there? 10 million, 7 million? I don't know. Millions. So I don't know why God allowed that kind of evil. And you know what? Nobody else on earth does either. And so I'm saying, let's just be honest about that. We don't have a full theodicy, don't have a full explanation of why God allows evil. But we have no reason to think God causes evil. And we can say a few things about why God might be patient in the face of evil. And that's all fine, but we're going to be short of any kind of full explanation, or even an explanation that allows us to be smug or boastful, because the problem of evil does leave us at the end in silence. We don't know why God allows so much of the horrifying evil that our world has seen. But there are areas of our experience that call out for explanation. And by looking there, we can begin to see evidence of God. It won't lead to a full explanation of the whole scope of our experience, but it will lead to a helpful explanation that can, shall we say, allow for God's working in this righteous way of trying to transform us into the moral character of his Son, Jesus Christ. There we find in conscience that kind of work underway, if we're honest about it. If we look to conscience, that's where we find God at work. And it's a God who doesn't give us a full explanation of why evil is as rampant as it is. And God told Job this. In fact, it was pretty clear that God set up the challenge for Job as one of, Job will learn to trust me. And indeed, God said Job already was a man who trusted him, even if Job suffered without full explanation. That was the big challenge. God instigated it, believe it or not. God wasn't a victim here. God set it up where Job was being tested. Do you trust me, even if you don't get your comfort now, and even if you can't fully explain why God has allowed this suffering? And Job, of course, underwent the test, and it seems that he's going back and forth at times. His friends are giving him advice. God shows up and says to his friends, in effect, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. And he turns to Job and says, Job, you have something to learn here. But in the end, Job didn't curse God. Job says to God in the end, I'll trust you in any case because I've seen your goodness here. I can't explain the world fully, but I've seen your goodness, God, and that's enough for me to trust you. So that's where we are with regard to full explanation. We don't have it. We know in part, but part of our knowing includes experience of God that's enough for us, as Paul says, not to be disappointed in our hope and trust in God. That's in Romans 5, because we have experienced the righteous love of God that comes from God and guides us in real life, in real experience, as we pay attention to it. So this is no abstract argument. This is no fancy speculative argument. We don't need those things. Those just get us playing little games about how do I fiddle with this part or that part? How do I tinker with this or that? We don't need that. We're not playing games here. If God cares for people, God will show up for them at the heart of their lives and show that care. And that's what I'm claiming is done in conscience if we pay attention. And I'm not the first to say this. The Apostle Paul said it in Romans 9. He said that what he was saying was confirmed by conscience and the Spirit of God at work in conscience. So the Apostle Paul beat me to all this good epistemology and religious experience. So I didn't have to make it up. He had these profound insights. I'm just trying to get them out there where they can be helpful to people in this vital discussion.
You also address another important question in the book, and that's the following. Should theistic belief be psychoanalyzed?
Sure, I'm happy to have anything psychoanalyzed as long as it's done in a way that is, shall we say, fair to the evidence. I find Freud seriously misguided. I've written about him in my book, Understanding Religious Experience. Freud wanted to be a philosopher, but he was terrible at attending to evidence, just terrible. He makes sweeping claims about human experience without giving any evidence. For example, his loopy view about the attitude of little boys toward their mother, this Oedipus stuff you may have read about. It's just loopy. I mean, there's no evidence for that stuff, but Freud bases a lot of his views on those claims, and he bases his views on a view of science that is just totally implausible, that somehow you can let the sciences take over all of our questions that are of significance. And you get the similar kind of tone in some of Richard Dawkins. They're just naive about how science works and how evidence in general works. The sciences themselves don't claim a monopoly on all knowledge. They don't. They allow for moral knowledge. The sciences allow for theological knowledge, even. They don't shut it down from the start. Freud, however, tries to make that kind of move, and it's just a disaster. For one thing, the sciences don't teach it, so where's he getting it? He's just making it up as part of his ideology. And there's some tones of that in Richard Dawkins, but Dawkins is a little more sophisticated there. He does say, though, that the claim that God exists must be treated as a scientific hypothesis. That's preposterous. That's just an ideology. Why should God be tied to the view that evidence given by God must be socially testable? So if God gives somebody a vision of something, it must be socially testable by a scientific community? That's just preposterous when you think about it. Why would God be bound by that? It depends on what God wants to accomplish. But again, Dawkins has this ideology, and he does it because it helps him get the result he wants. But it's called question begging. You can't treat a topic honestly with that kind of bias. And so the use of psychoanalysis must be very careful here. It can't be Freudian, because Freud traces it all back to a kind of bizarre story that's Oedipal and then has to do somehow with a certain kind of evidence that's inherently scientific. But there's no reason to go there. Why tie your hands with that kind of, shall we say, limited, suffocating evidence? It just doesn't work when you narrow evidence in that way. Why would you think God is bound by it? I mean, if Dawkins had just started with the question of, is God willing to be limited to this kind of socially shared scientific evidence? You get the answer right away. We have no reason to think God would be. What if God just wants to deal with this person at this place and not with a larger social audience? So it just starts with an assumption that you have to call preposterous on reflection. And as I say, Freud has similar assumptions, and they just sink the whole boat that those two are in. So yeah, other kinds of psychoanalysis that are fair to evidence, fine. I have no problem, but not Freudian. It's too prejudiced.
Great, great. Well, since we are talking about philosophy and science, how important is philosophy in the existence of God? I mean, looking, for the existence of God from a philosophical perspective.
Well, that's a good question, Andres. I look at it this way. The world is a very polluted place. There are so many misleading views out there. It's a thicket. It's a jungle of dangerous views, and they come from all over the place since the beginning of time. And so the history of philosophy is just a mess of a lot of harmful views, and rarely one that sheds much real light. And Plato even knew that. Even during the time of Plato, was already a mess with the sophists and what Plato himself bought into the Parmenidean picture which was extremist. But you're just flooded with all of these misleading views, and you need the tools to sort through them somehow, to avoid being taken in by them. And so philosophy can help there with some conceptual clarity. But the actual speculative arguments of philosophy, those you get in natural theology and from some other philosophers, God doesn't need those at all. And I've never seen one that has been actually defensible in the end, because I think God is working at a much deeper level than speculative arguments. I just don't see those arguments delivering what they claim to, because they don't deliver a God worthy of worship, a God who is morally perfect. They deal with some kind of lesser God, some kind of God who isn't morally perfect and has a few traits that may or may not be included in the true God, the God worthy of worship. So I don't find philosophy indispensable for getting evidence of God. I think God provides the evidence and self-authenticates God's existence in the experience of God, especially in the fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about in Galatians 5. Love, joy, peace, faith. Paul gives a whole list. I call these personality traits of God. And that's what the book God and Moral Experience develops, that these personality traits that we've taken to be abstract values, love, joy, peace, those are the very character traits of God's moral personality, and we overlook them. We treat them as if they're something else, as abstract ideas or values. No, that's God at work in your experience. And so you don't need philosophy to respond to that experience, certainly not to have that experience. Philosophy can step in when things get confusing and you need to sort stuff out and give you conceptual distinctions. So I think its role there is largely negative. I've never seen its role work as a sort of positive philosophical argument. And I've been looking for one for well over 50 years, and I'm still waiting. I mean, I invite people all the time. Send me your best argument, and I would be glad to look at it. That's the way I approach it. I'm open to it, but I simply haven't found the kind of argument we need to get to God's existence where God is worthy of worship.
Since we are talking about philosophy, the existence of God, I would like to talk about the misunderstood relationship between faith and reason. You know, normally we find these misunderstandings at the popular levels. So, what can you tell us about the relationship between faith and reason?
Yeah, everything depends on what you mean by faith and reason, and people mean a million different things by those terms. So I don't even start that discussion until people tell me what they mean. And all I mean by faith here is a cooperative yes response to something presented in your experience. A faith response to God, then, is a positive cooperative response to God's intervention in our experience, in our conscience. A response of faith is to trust that intervention in our experience for its being good. That's what faith is. It's not a leap in the dark. It's a response to evidence in experience, a positive response that includes trust. That's what faith is. As for reason, people mean a million things by it. By it, I just mean typically evidence. But then other people want to say, no, it's more than evidence, and they want to talk about argument. Well, not all evidence, not all reason is an argument. An experience can be a reason for doing something, but an experience is not an argument. A toothache can be a reason to go to the dentist, but a toothache isn't an argument. It's an experience. So also, God showing up in my conscience, that's an experience, but it's not an argument. It's God's character intervening in my moral awareness. That's called a reason for me, because here's what the key is. A reason or evidence is what indicates that something is true. An experience can indicate that something is true without being an argument. It doesn't have to have premises and a conclusion. And so there's a lot of confusion there on that word reason. And I just try to cut through it by talking about evidence and then a response to the evidence. And faith is the kind of response that's cooperative and you could call it a trust response or an obedience response. It's faith in God. It's not faith that something is true. Faith that is just a belief that something is true. But faith in God is much deeper than a belief that something is true.
And what do you think of the idea of the incognoscibility of God? I mean, it may be the case that God exists, but as humans, we don't have epistemic access to that information. So, is God cognoscible?
It's a big question. If knowledge is justified true belief, then I claim yes, there can be knowledge, because there can be the right kind of evidence based on experience, religious experience. That would be the evidence. And you can believe based on that evidence that God exists. And if that belief is true and the belief is based on the evidence, you have knowledge. You have justified true belief, the kind of thing Plato talked about in the Theaetetus. And that's different from certainty. It doesn't mean that you can't be mistaken. It just means you aren't mistaken. And so a mere possibility of mistake will not undermine knowledge that God exists, because knowledge doesn't require certainty of that strong sort. I claim it includes a different kind of certainty. I'd call it moral certainty based on moral experience and how God transforms people morally to be different kinds of people who live by righteous love instead of selfishness or unrighteousness. And I claim there's a kind of moral certainty there, but that's very different from what Descartes was after or some other philosophers. But it is knowledge indeed. And so faith can be part of kind of a knowledge of God.
When we are talking about the existence of God, you know, this topic, the objection that we as a humans have created God often raises. But is it true? Can the idea of God be a human invention? What do you think?
Yeah, that was a big claim by Freud. Freud claimed that we have this need for a father figure, and so we fabricate God's existence to satisfy an infantile need that we have, or supposed need, to save us from fear and to give us a kind of sense of control. Freud emphasizes that endlessly, and it's a huge mistake that he's making, because so much of theology, if you're talking about a God worthy of worship, is not the kind of thing we fabricate for our comfort. On the contrary, and that's why you get in some of the Hebrew prophets and in the New Testament this theme of having an experience of God and then saying, "Depart from me, God." It isn't, "Oh God, thank you for this comforting view. You've now made life easy." On the contrary, Isaiah says, "Holy, holy, holy. I'm a man of unclean lips." And the theme is, "Depart from me, God. This holiness, this righteousness is too much for me." We see it in the New Testament too. Peter's response to Jesus, "Depart from me. I'm a man of unclean lips. I'm a man of moral shortcomings." So the idea that we create God for our comfort doesn't fit the facts of experience. We often go along with God in the discomfort, in the actual, shall we say, resistance to our ordinary inclinations. That's not creating God or fabricating. That's called conforming to a moral being who brings pain in the moral transformation, brings struggle and strife. And the Apostle Paul writes about it extensively in his second letter to the Corinthians, the pain, the dying every day, so that God's character can show through us despite our moral shortcomings. So that claim just doesn't fit the facts.
Yeah, unfortunately, many people still continue to raise these kinds of objections. Now, I would like to talk about the difference between evidence and proof. Some Christians often say that they have proof of God's existence. Is that the case?
Yeah, here's what I tell my students. Don't use the word proof in my class. Here's why. And I also say don't use the phrase "true for us" in my class. We're out to get rid of those uses, unless you're doing math or logic. We're not doing proofs. We aren't. You don't do proofs for existing persons like you, me, God, and so on. You don't. You don't find your way there by proofs because they aren't objects of math or logic. And any attempt to give a proof will fall short because you're going to find that the evidence is not mathematical or purely mathematical or logical. So just throw the word away and talk about good evidence. Then you won't confuse people. And you can then say, no problem, because the sciences don't work by mathematical or logical proof either. They work by best explanation on the basis of experiential evidence. That's what the sciences do. I mean the natural sciences, of course. And math and logic are in a different category. And the reason I say that is because in math and logic, there's a big focus on the purely definitional. You start with the definitions in geometry, you formulate those definitions, and then you try to formulate some axioms on the basis of those definitions, and then you draw inferences. That's the way the story goes in geometry. That's not how it goes in theological knowledge or in scientific knowledge. It's empirical in these other domains in this sense. It requires evidence from experience for its premises, and its inferences are often non-deductive. They don't give you the kind of airtight connection between premises and conclusion that you should get in typical math and logic. So I say just don't use that word. You just confuse people. Just talk about adequate evidence for knowledge.
Great. Now, if we don't have a proof of God's existence, can we as a Christians claim to have certainty of God's existence, or will that be a mistake?
It depends on what you mean by certainty. We don't have logical certainty. We can imagine that all of our experience is a dream, is a hallucination, or that's logically coherent. The whole thing could be just a dream. That's logically coherent. There's no contradiction in assuming that. And so what? We know a lot of things that don't admit of any kind of logical proof. All of our scientific knowledge could be but a dream. But we don't say, therefore, we don't know. We say, therefore, we don't have mathematical or logical knowledge in those domains. But that's no surprise. Those domains are talking about existing objects in an empirical world, or a world at least of broad experience. And so when you get back to Plato, who was influenced by Parmenides, you get the extreme view that if you don't have something like pure certainty, you don't have knowledge. So you can't have knowledge of any changing reality. Well, that's just a bias. And he got it from Parmenides, who said that if there's any change, you don't have reality. That's just false. And why Plato bought that extreme claim is just a mystery, and it undermines his whole system. Aristotle bought it too, and it undermines his system. And Parmenides is the culprit. They went along with his view that reality can't change. Reality must be perfect, and what's perfect can't change. There's no reason to hold that view. In fact, there's every reason to reject it. Something can be real and change. In fact, you're going to be morally imperfect if you don't have some change, because you need to adapt your caring response to a world that changes. So we need to let go of the kind of mathematical immutability model that Plato promoted along with Aristotle on the basis of Parmenides. It's messed up so much theology and left so many people confused, but you must kick it away. It's just confused.
Yeah, this is one of the issues that theists have to avoid when talking about the existence of God. What other mistakes do you think theists should avoid when talking about this issue?
I think the biggest mistake is inadequate attention to conscience where God works. We look everywhere for evidence for God, except where it actually is, in our moral struggle in conscience. If we put our attention there and are honest about it, God comes to life in our experience and in our own lives. The trouble is, we have so many other areas that we focus on that we miss the point. And, Jesus tried to point to that kind of thing in the parable of the sower. We have so many different cares and concerns. We don't attend to his active work in our conscience to get the reality of God recognized and obeyed. I mean, obedience is crucial here because we're not just talking about an ordinary entity. We're talking about the morally supreme God of the universe. And therefore, our approaching that God works only with the spirit of obedience. And that's why Gethsemane is so important in the ministry of Jesus. It's the defining point where he settles on whether he will put his will over God's will. And at first he says, God, let this cup pass from me. In other words, I need a plan B here because things aren't looking good. I'm going up to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. Get me out of here. And then he uses one word that changes the history of mankind, but not what I will, Father, rather what you will. That's called obedience. That is the only avenue to God because God is morally perfect and we are not. And so we must yield in our moral imperfection to God's moral perfection. Where is that perfection? It's in what Paul calls the fruit of the Spirit at work in our conscience. Love, joy, peace, and so on, as challenging us to let go of selfishness, to let go of those things that kill us and those around us. Until we get there, we won't see God at work because that's what God is trying to do, to break through, to build a community of God's people who live by love, joy, peace, patience, and the fruit of the Spirit that are personality traits of a God worthy of worship. Arguments pale in comparison. We don't end up talking about premises and questionable inferences. It's like looking into a mirror. Now that we've seen these character traits, love, joy, peace, kindness, faith, patience, what's going on there? How do I stand up to those? How do I look in the mirror when those are the standard? And the response is, woe is me, God. I need to repent. I need to turn to you for a new kind of life. Until we get there, we aren't talking about the true God. We're talking about a false God, a God of our speculation, our casual reflection. That is not the God who was the burning fire that Moses met, the God that Abraham had met, and the God that Jesus and Paul promoted. That is a God whom the author of Hebrews calls a consuming fire of moral goodness, not of rageful judgment, but of compassion for all those in need of it.
Can belief in God be rational without evidence? This properly basic belief.
No, we don't need. There are no well-grounded beliefs without evidence, and that whole Reformed epistemology movement is clouded with so much confusion because it's trying to do too many things, and it just gets confused about the nature of evidence, and it's a moving target. It's formulated in so many different ways, and I find it just confuses people. A lot of people jump on the bandwagon and they use that jargon that you used, but beliefs aren't going to have any kind of adequate support or status as basic unless there's a special kind of evidence. And that tradition, that doesn't touch the kind of evidence we need, what I call the fruit of God's Spirit in moral experience. It has no role for that. It talks about the testimony of the Spirit sometime, but what on earth is that? And until you link that to the role in conscience of God's personality traits in the fruit of the Spirit, you're talking at a level of abstraction that's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to be a real challenge. It's just jargon. The testimony of the Spirit. Well, what is that? That's what we want to know. And that's what Paul is getting to in Galatians 5. And that's completely ignored by this whole so-called Reformed epistemology tradition. I find it just confuses people. But a lot of academics jump on the bandwagon. And just because it gives them something to say that, you can cite a prolific philosopher on, but I find that just unhelpful altogether.
Interesting. So we should reformulate and be careful with our arguments.
It's not about argument. It's about pointing to what God has done in a life, how God has worked in the real world. People don't need more arguments. They have enough. They'll just get confused if you start throwing arguments. Tell them, if you can, candidly, how God has worked in your life, how God's Spirit has moved you in your moral experience to give up selfishness, to be concerned about righteousness and care for others, including your enemies. Enemy love is the biggest test. If you can show love to your enemy, you know God is at work there. You don't need an argument to see how significant that is. You just need to cooperate with what God is trying to do, and then let other people know there's something going on here. You may have missed it like the fly on your nose, but it's time to look at it. And if you look at it, if you look at your conscience, God does emerge. God comes to you and has been trying to do that. And that's more powerful than any argument that a philosopher can give. So I'm saying, put first things first. Put first how God actually works in human experience in a way fitting with what Jesus taught, with what Paul taught, and then God does the rest. Only God can convince people of God's reality. Our flimsy arguments aren't going to do that. We should know that by now. They've just created more noise and more of a mess. And so we need to get back to what I call the actual work of God in the fruit of the Spirit in our moral experience. And then we will see the power of God at work, and we will see that it's unique and that it gives life. And then we won't be so stressed by the jungle, the thicket of philosophy and theology. We can then live above that thicket and jungle, and that's where the Spirit of God actually lives.
Oh, I think this is really important, especially for people who are involved in apologetics and also in the philosophy of religion. Many times, these people tend to focus only on the arguments, on the intellectual side, and they usually forget, what God has done in their life, and also what God can do in the life of other people.
Yes, we forget who God is. We make God out in our own image. We often over-intellectualize God. We make God a lot like us if we're overly intellectual, and that's to rob God of God's power. And that's why Paul wrote 1 Corinthians chapters 1 and 2. He was facing a problem like this in Corinth, and he spoke to it directly with a contrast between God's wisdom and human wisdom. I recommend that, the opening of 1 Corinthians.
Thank you, Dr. Moser, for that answer. Now, what would you say to those Christians who perhaps intellectualize their faith too much, leaving, the gospel as such a side and focusing much more on the rational side?
Yeah, I would say, Lord, have mercy. That's how I'd start. Lord, have mercy. And then I would say, who's going to be your guide in all of this? Some philosopher you've heard of, or you're going to look at what Jesus and Paul did in the same context. If you look at Jesus and you look at Paul, read the New Testament, you will find an approach to knowledge of God that is much more resilient, much more powerful than any of the familiar apologists or philosophers have offered. And so I would urge people to go back and read what Jesus and Paul said on these topics, and treat that very seriously. Don't let peer pressure control you. Don't let what's a trend or a fad control you. Beware of the jargon that gets popular. Go back to what Jesus and Paul were doing. And I would say, if you get in line there, you will find a life worth living.
Thank you. Thank you for your words, Dr. Moser. Well, the last question. I would like to close by talking about divine hidings. I know it's a very broad topic. We could even have just a single interview talking about that. But briefly, I would like to hear what you have to say about it.
That's a big question, but an important one. Um, I have a book called Divine Guidance that has a section on hiding. Sometimes people benefit from that. But I would say this, focus on divine hiding after you get clear on how God self-reveals to us and self-authenticates for us. Once you understand how God self-reveals through the fruit of the Spirit in moral experience, then you can go back and say, why might God pull back at times from this self-revelation? And the answer is because sometimes we need it. By God pulling back a little, we can then feel the absence of God and wake up and say, whoa, I've missed something important. God doesn't hide out of spite. God hides out of bringing us to our senses if we will come to that. But divine hiding is a reality, and God will not cast pearls in a way that trivializes this completely valuable effort to bring people into fellowship with God. So hiding is, shall we say, a kind of second effort on God's part to wake us up and to come to our senses.
Well, Dr. Moser, thank you so much for this answer and for the whole interview, actually. It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Andres, and God bless.
Well, God bless you and God bless your ministry. Hope you can come back soon. Bye. Muchas gracias por ver esta entrevista. Espero que realmente haya sido de beneficio para ustedes. Si por casualidad han notado mi voz un poco rara, es porque estoy un poco enfermo, pero de todas maneras quería subir esta entrevista porque, bueno, considero que es importante y realmente espero que pueda aportar algo eh, en el conocimiento y en la información que ustedes siguen investigando. Así que nada, espero que si les ha gustado puedan compartirlo con aquellas personas que crean que puedan también verse persuadidas o puedan gustarles este tipo de contenido y que puedan, si no se han suscrito al canal, puedan suscribirse y apoyarme también con un like. Gracias y que bueno, que Dios les bendiga y ya nos vemos pronto con una nueva entrevista. Hasta luego.